The Lord of the Rings trilogy has become so ingrained in popular culture that it's difficult to imagine how it might have looked with a different cast. But several notable actors turned down big roles. Here are some of the names who could have resided in Middle-earth. According to reports, Sean Connery was offered the role of Gandalf before it went to Ian McKellen. Peter Jackson was apparently so keen on landing the former Bond actor that he convinced New Line to offer Connery a 15% slice of the box office takings, plus a $30 million pay packet. The Lord of the Rings trilogy made just shy of $3 billion worldwide, so it was a pretty costly decision, especially when you consider the fact that Connery went on to star in the career-ending The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen instead. So why did the iconic Scot turn down the chance to play Tolkien's most famous wizard?
I'll take swords for 400.
In 2012, a retired Connery admitted that he said no to The Lord of the Rings because he just couldn't get his head around the sprawling story. The actor said, "I read the book, I read the script, I saw the movie. I still don't understand it." Ian McKellen, I believe, is marvelous in it. When McKellen was asked about Jackson's pursuit of Connery during an interview with Total Film, he joked that the films would have been, quote, very different had Connery chosen to take on the role, saying, "Gandalf would have come from Scotland for a start. You shall not pass." Doesn't have quite the same ring to it, does it?
Stay back if you value your life.
Christopher Plummer grew up reading The Lord of the Rings and has admitted to being a huge fan of Tolkien's world. But he still chose to turn down the opportunity to play Gandalf when Peter Jackson came calling. Years later, the actor revealed that he had an issue with the level of commitment required. For Plummer, spending 3 years in New Zealand at his age just wasn't an option. He explained to Conan O'Brien,
I thought there are other countries I'd also like to visit before I croak.
He added that the, quote, absolutely marvelous Ian McKellen brought a warmth to the wizard that he himself may not have been able to produce.
I might have been a little cold and imperious.
Plummer has still done some memorable work since passing on Rings. Not that he had anything left to prove after carving out his illustrious career. He was nominated for a Primetime Emmy for playing Cardinal Bernard Law in the Catholic Church abuse drama Our Fathers in 2005, and in 2012 he scooped up his first Academy Award, triumphing in the Best Supporting Actor category for beginners. His win made him the oldest actor to take home a competitive Oscar. Plummer almost beat his own record in 2018 when he was nominated for All the Money in the World, a role he famously took over for a scandal-hit Kevin Spacey at the last minute. But he was beaten by Sam Rockwell for 3 billboards outside Ebbing, Missouri. Peter Jackson is said to have attempted to convince Daniel Day-Lewis to take on the role of Aragorn on numerous occasions. Supposedly, the 3-time Best Actor winner repeatedly spurned his advances according to The One Ring, which had the inside track on all things The Lord of the Rings back when the trilogy was still in development. In October 1999, a source told the Tolkien fan site that producers had made one final push to get Day-Lewis on board, stating, DDL has been offered the Aragorn role again. He has been offered the Middle-earth to take the role. The producers think he'll say no again, but they don't want to miss the chance to try him. Day-Lewis addressed the long-running Aragorn rumors over a decade later, confirming that he was indeed offered the part. Speaking to MTV's Josh Horowitz in 2009, the notoriously picky method actor said that he rejected the role because big franchise films just aren't his bag. He explained, "They can be fantastically entertaining for the people who love to see them, but it's not for me. If I found myself working on a film and during the course of that work I was bored, because I didn't really know what the hell I was involved in, I would find that infinitely demoralizing, and it might well make me decide to pack my bags." Day-Lewis retired from acting in 2017. The idea of Nicolas Cage playing Aragorn might sound like nightmare fuel, but believe it or not, this almost came to pass. Cage was a headliner at the time, fresh off starring roles in Con Air, Face Off, and Snake Eyes.
No! Yes! No, come on, this is not fair, man. Come on!
Call the cop!
Taking the lead in a big-budget epic like The Lord of the Rings would have been the next logical step for him, but he was forced to turn down Peter Jackson's offer because he had, quote, family obligations that he couldn't ignore. It wasn't the only huge role he passed on either. Cage also said no to The Matrix. The actor said, "Both are great movies, but they both shot for great quantities of time, I mean years. Australia was The Matrix, and New Zealand was The Lord of the Rings." Cage expanded on his explanation during a 2015 interview with Newsweek, where he said of The Lord of the Rings, "There were different things going on in my life at the time that precluded me from being able to travel and be away from home for 3 years." He has absolutely no regrets, however, saying, "I get to enjoy the movies as an audience member, because I don't watch my own movies." Had his schedule been different, perhaps the state of his career today would be different too. For better or worse, Cage was unable to take the part, and we're left wondering what bizarre accent he might have given the future King of Gondor. By the time New Zealand native Russell Crowe was approached about the Aragorn vacancy, the Lord of the Rings budget was starting to look a little stretched. They didn't have enough cash to give Crowe a suitable upfront fee, so producers offered him a percentage of the takings instead. It wasn't enough to tempt him, though years later, Crowe conceded that it would have been a risk well worth taking. In 2011, the actor delivered a lecture about his career in the business to film students at England's Durham University. According to The Telegraph, Crowe talked about turning down the Aragorn role, joking that he wouldn't have needed to do paid appearances had he agreed to New Line's offer of 10% of the Lord of the Rings profits. So why didn't he? Crowe didn't reveal the reasoning behind his costly decision until 2019, when Howard Stern decided to probe him about it.
I didn't think Peter Jackson actually wanted me on the film, because I think he was forced into talking to me, because there was a moment in time when everybody wanted me in everything.
Crowe knew that something wasn't right when he spoke to Jackson over the phone about the part, though. He said he had an instinct Jackson wanted someone else for the part, Viggo Mortensen. Kate Winslet started getting linked with a possible appearance in The Lord of the Rings as soon as New Line announced that Peter Jackson was going to spearhead its ambitious 3-movie project. The director gave the British starlet her big break when he cast her in 1994's Heavenly Creatures, a psychological drama based on a famous New Zealand case involving 2 teenage killers. By the time Jackson started casting for The Lord of the Rings, Winslet was a huge star, having been nominated for Academy Awards in the Best Supporting Actress and Best Leading Actress categories for 1995's Sense and Sensibility and 1997's Titanic, respectively. She had her pick of projects at the time, and The Lord of the Rings just wasn't appealing enough. Winslet was reportedly offered the role of Rohan Shieldmaiden Arwen, but she had some commitment issues, according to an email allegedly written by former New Line Cinema president of production, Michael DeLuca. The supposed email, which was forwarded to the Lord of the Rings fan site The One Ring by an inside source, read, "Winslet's unavailable, I'm afraid. I think she passed on the project due to the length of time it takes." Some people might view that as a gross error of judgment on Winslet's part, but her career didn't suffer as a result. She's been nominated for another 4 Oscars in the years since, winning 1. Uma Thurman certainly has a high fantasy look about her. It's easy to imagine the actress as Galadriel, but that's not the part that Peter Jackson had in mind for her. The director wanted Thurman to play Arwen, the same character that Kate Winslet was approached about. Thurman also turned the part down, though unlike Winslet, it wasn't just a time issue. She and her then-husband Ethan Hawke had just welcomed their first daughter Maya when the offer was made, presenting the new mother with a difficult choice. In the end, Thurman decided to put family first and reject Jackson's overtures, though she later admitted that the decision still haunts her. She confirmed to MTV in 2008, "Yeah, I was asked. It just caught me at the wrong moment. I wish I had done it. Oh, I truly wish I could have been able to take that plunge, and maybe I should have, but I just couldn't at the time." When she appeared on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert almost a decade later, the Kill Bill star admitted that rejecting The Lord of the Rings was, quote, "one of the worst decisions of her entire career."
I had just had my first child, and I don't know, I was a little housebound.
At one stage, husband and wife team Uma Thurman and Ethan Hawke looked set to appear in The Lord of the Rings together, with the latter confirming his planned involvement at the Toronto Film Festival. Hawke not only revealed that he would be playing Boromir's younger brother Faramir, a role that eventually went to Australian actor David Wenham, he also let slip that Tolkien's enigmatic supporting character, Tom Bombadil, had been cut from the screenplay. The actor went on to gush over the author's work, claiming he had been a fan of the Tolkien series since childhood. Despite his obvious excitement, Hawke pulled out of the picture, perhaps leaving his wife at home to care for their newborn daughter after she had turned down a part in the same movie wasn't an option for the actor, who takes parenthood so seriously that he was inspired to write a book about it. His now ex-wife has admitted that she regrets rejecting The Lord of the Rings, but does Hawke feel the same? He didn't explicitly say that he wished he had taken the Faramir role, but when he sat down with Variety in 2018, he revealed that he was still waiting for his big blockbuster moment, saying, "Before I die, I would really like to give a meaningful performance inside a really commercial film." Lucy Lawless is best known for starring in the much-loved Xena Warrior Princess. The New Zealander seemed to be the perfect fit. She had plenty of fantasy experience and the kind of flawless features that Galadriel is known for in the novels. But it wasn't meant to be.
Sometimes people do things that they regret.
Lawless was pregnant when Jackson approached her about the role, and the director clearly failed to sell The Lord of the Rings to her because she forgot to turn up for the audition. In a 2003 interview with Hot Celebs magazine, Lawless revealed that she also turned down a chance to appear in Fox's franchise opener X-Men at the time, despite knowing that she probably wouldn't get another shot at the big leagues. She said, "You know what might happen? By the time I'm ready and want to do a multi-year contract, they won't want me. But what can I do? I've turned down great things. It's not worth it if your children are miserable." Her prediction came true, and although Lawless is still working today, having starred in the Australian crime series My Life is Murder in 2019 and voiced an alien queen in 2 2020 episodes of Star Wars Resistance, her career could have been a whole lot different if she had agreed to portray Tolkien's telepathic elf.
What's stronger, a Witch King or a White Wizard? And what happened to all those magic rings anyway? Keep watching to find out everything you didn't know you wanted to know about the mythology of Lord of the Rings. Right from the get-go, elves and dwarves clearly have some serious beef. Indeed, these two ancient Middle-earth races are at odds at practically every step. In The Hobbit, the dwarves are less than friendly with the elves of Rivendell, and they're later straight up imprisoned by the elves of Mirkwood. In The Lord of the Rings, Gimli and Legolas begin their friendship at odds. The elven princeling hates the idea of going into Moria, and the dwarf is nearly refused admission into Lothlorien.
Ishkakui, Aidorugmul. That was not so courteous.
The animosity between elf and dwarf is a theme that stretches far back through their ancient histories, which are told in the Silmarillion. This book reveals that the root of the conflict can be found in each race's creation. Middle-earth's dwarves were brought into being by an angelic creature named Aule, who made them in an act of disobedience. As he waited for the creator, Ilúvatar, to bring the elves into the world, Aule became impatient, so he made the dwarves instead. Ilúvatar caught Aule red-handed, but the creator chose to give these new creations their own individual wills. However, he also told Aule that, "Often strife shall arise between thine and mine, the children of my adoption and the children of my choice." This immediately set the tone for the dwarves to live fiercely independent lives, separate from the other children of Ilúvatar, and often in direct competition with them.
The age of men is over. The time of the orc has come.
In The Two Towers, Treebeard tells Merry and Pippin that orcs were made in mockery of elves during Middle-earth's Great Darkness. However, Tolkien never totally clarified the exact origin of the orcs. Nevertheless, in the Silmarillion, he does offer one very compelling account for their creation. Tolkien explains that when the elves first came into existence, they were alone in Middle-earth, living in childlike innocence in a world of perpetual starlight. Eventually, they became afraid of wandering off alone, as an unknown being they called the Hunter had begun to carry them off. This Hunter turned out to be the Dark Lord Morgoth and his servants. The fate of his captives was uncertain, but it was surmised by the wise of Middle-earth that, by slow arts of cruelty, the elves were corrupted and enslaved. and thus did Morgoth breed the hideous race of the orcs in envy and mockery of the elves, of whom they were afterwards the bitterest foes. While the orcs likely began as corrupted elves, before long they had taken on their own attributes. But even as the enemies of Middle-earth's free peoples, Tolkien points out that deep in their dark hearts, the orcs still loathe the maker of their misery. The creation of the orcs has been referred to by Tolkien as Morgoth's vilest deed, and the one that caused the most offense to Iluvatar. So, you know where orcs come from, but what's the deal with Uruk-hai? How are Saruman's oversized servants different from their orcish counterparts? After all, they appear to have orcish features, but they're uncommonly tall and muscular. Much like the history of the orcs themselves, Tolkien was never crystal clear about the answer to this question, but he does offer a few hints in The Two Towers.
Whom do you serve? Saruman.
First of all, it seems fair to suggest that the Uruk-hai are an offshoot breed of orcs. In other words, they are at least partially part of the orc family tree. In The Two Towers, Treebeard states that Saruman has been doing something to the orcs, something dangerous, for these Isengarders are more like wicked men. He adds that normal orcs cannot stand the sun, but the Uruk-hai can, even if they don't exactly love it. From there, Treebeard wonders, are they men he has ruined, or has he blended the races of orcs and men? During the Battle of Helm's Deep, the Uruk-hai are also referred to as half-orcs and goblin men. While the truth remains hazy, it appears that the White Wizard may have crossbred orcs and men to create his own breed of soldier. The exact purpose of the One Ring is kept vague in both the Lord of the Rings films and the books. However, if you cobble together enough of the facts, it is possible to paint a better picture of the true power of everyone's favorite trinket. In the Silmarillion, Sauron forges the One Ring partway through the Second Age. When this happens, he binds the other rings of power to it in order to gain an intimate level of domination over their owners. In essence, Sauron is able to use the ring to see what the other ring bearers are thinking and even control their thoughts.
One ring to bring them all, and in the darkness, fight them.
However, Sauron's initial plan backfires, and the elves prove strong enough to resist his will. Nevertheless, the One Ring retains its control over most of the other rings of power, existing primarily as an instrument of evil domination. While this is the primary purpose of the One Ring, it also provides the wearer with several other advantages. Obviously, it can make an individual disappear when they want to. It can also slow the aging process or even halt it indefinitely. On top of that, when Sam briefly puts on the ring after fleeing Shelob's lair, he is able to understand the conversation of nearby orcs. In the text, Tolkien suggests that the ring may have given him the ability to translate the orcs' language. Notably, the same thing happened to Bilbo when he encountered the spiders of Mirkwood in The Hobbit. The timelines of Peter Jackson's movies and Tolkien's books come to cross purposes fairly early in the telling. Arguably, this throws off the timing of the whole story, leading to the question, how long does Frodo have the One Ring before he becomes Mordor-bound? The correct answer in the books is 17 years. Frodo receives his inheritance from Bilbo on his 33rd birthday. In the movie version of that long-expected party, Merry and Pippin are practically full-grown when they get into trouble with Gandalf. This gives the understandable impression that very little time passes between that event and the moment at which the four hobbits begin their quest. The truth is, though, in the book version of The Fellowship of the Ring, a whopping 17 years elapse between Frodo getting the ring and Frodo leaving the Shire. And that's 17 years exactly, in fact. He receives the ring on his 33rd birthday and departs the Shire on his 50th. In the novel, this goes a long way in explaining why he's so attached to the ring right from the get-go. While John Noble does a fantastic job portraying Denethor on the silver screen, the cinematic version of The Steward of Gondor doesn't exactly do justice to the book. He's arrogant to a fault, blinded by pride, and literally tells his men to leave Minas Tirith when it comes under attack.
Abandon your post! Flee! Flee for your life!
Worst of all, he orders Faramir to attack Osgiliath when there's no question that he's going to be mown down by an army of orcish archers. All of this behavior is so over the top that it begs the question, what the heck is going on? Well, if you turn to the original text, the answer becomes clear. Namely, the fact that his poor judgment is far more nuanced in the books. Denethor isn't a mad tyrant openly trying to kill his son. On the contrary, while he does make his disappointment in Faramir clear, he doesn't send his son on a suicide mission. Instead, when Faramir retreats to Minas Tirith to report on the situation in Osgiliath, Denethor simply asks him to return and bolster the defenses. More generally, the Steward's hopeless despair comes about because he has been battling Sauron's will through one of the Palantir. All in all, the book version of Denethor is a deeply flawed man, but he's also strong and noble, and gives everything he has to the defense of Gondor. Hobbits are a curious people. They share similarities with men, dwarves, and even elves at times, which often leads to the question of whether or not Tolkien meant for them to be related to any of these other races. Well, they are related to one of them. Men, to be precise. At least, they're most likely related to them. Again, Tolkien left this one a little open-ended. In the prologue to The Fellowship of the Ring, he spends a decent amount of time breaking down the history, ancestry, and culture of the Little People. In the middle of the breakdown, he straight up states that, "It is plain indeed that in spite of later estrangement, hobbits are relatives of men." While this is presented as an obvious fact, he also points out that the beginning of hobbits lies far back in the Elder Days that are now lost and forgotten. He also points out that the true relationship between hobbits and men, quote, "can no longer be discovered." So while Tolkien refuses to make any specific connection between the two, he all but declares that hobbits are a miniature version of the big people. A number of rings of power appear throughout The Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit movies. 9 rings are wielded by mortal men doomed to die. The 3 elven rings are used to keep all that is good and holy intact. And of course, there's the One Ring itself, which serves as the focal point to the entire story. But what about the 7 dwarven rings? These are shown briefly at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring, and they're mentioned every time the Ring poem is recited. But that's about it. So what happened to them? Well, Gandalf provides a bit of clarity on the subject in the Fellowship of the Ring when he hastily brings Frodo up to date on the long lore of the Rings of Power. He briefly mentions that 7 the Dwarf Kings possessed, but 3 Sauron has recovered, and the others the dragons have consumed. This is partially confirmed later on when Gandalf suggests that dragonfire could destroy the lesser rings. Then at the Council of Elrond, Glóin informs the group that a messenger from Mordor asked for the dwarves' help in hunting for the One Ring. The price offered in exchange? 3 rings that the dwarf sires possessed of old. One of the biggest issues that many fans have with the Lord of the Rings movies comes from a scene in the extended edition of The Return of the King, in which the Witch King confronts Gandalf on the walls of Minas Tirith.
This is my power.
Faced with the awesome power of the White Wizard, Sauron's captain nonetheless overpowers him, destroying his staff and sending him hurtling to the ground. So is Gandalf the White really weaker than one of the Nazgûl? While this is a generally speculative question, it's probably safe to assume that Peter Jackson and company overstepped a little here. That's not a knock against the Witch King, of course. Angmar's erstwhile ruler is thousands of years old, wields a ring of power, and is backed by the strongest being in Middle-earth. But we're not comparing him to a run-of-the-mill mortal here, or even an elven lord. This is Gandalf. He's an angelic being placed inside a mortal body, one who is older than time itself, and happens to be secretly wielding one of the elven rings of power. No matter which way you slice it, the Witch King would never be able to defeat Gandalf this easily. In the books, the two characters do briefly face each other, but before they can come to blows, the Rohirrim arrive and the Witch King retreats. Still, it's probably safe to say that the Witch King wouldn't have won that fight.
What happened during Tolkien's second age of Middle-earth that has led the creative minds at Amazon to explore this era during their Lord of the Rings series? Let's dive into this little-discussed saga. A second age implies that there was a first age that came before it, and Tolkien's first age is the primary subject of his book, The Silmarillion. The book focuses on the adventures and tragedies of the elves and their epic wars with the Dark Lord Morgoth. After centuries of bloodshed, Morgoth is finally defeated in the earth-shattering War of Wrath. The event is action-packed, with tons of dragons, eagles, orcs, elves, men, and even a bunch of Balrogs and other supernatural creatures to boot. When all is said and done, the survivors on both sides flee. Most of the elves head west to the same heavenly land that Frodo and Bilbo sailed toward at the end of The Return of the King. However, a few of the elves, along with the men, dwarves, and any surviving baddies, head further into Middle-earth, which is where the second age picks up. While Amazon won't be exploring the first age, There's no doubt that it will be an important backdrop as the show unfolds. The Second Age begins with a bunch of refugees looking for new homes. And while there are too many stories of settling here and kingdom building there to explain them all in detail, a few of these new settlements are worth noting. First is Meathland, a port settled by elves in the first year of the Second Age. The harbor is located on the northwestern shores of the continent, and it becomes Middle-earth's primary connection to the Forgotten West. Fans of the films will recognize Meathland by its more commonly known title of the Grey Havens, the same spot where Frodo and Bilbo eventually head out to sea in ring-bearing retirement.
I think I'm quite ready for another adventure.
Almost 1,700 years after the Grey Havens is built, the elvish stronghold Rivendell is founded by everyone's favorite counselor, Elrond. This time, the settling takes place by necessity after Elrond has a nasty run-in with Sauron, also known as Imladris, and the last homely house east of the sea. Rivendell will stand as one of the chief bastions of protection for the free people of Middle-earth throughout the rest of the Second and Third Ages, and it will go on to feature prominently in the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit stories. One of the first casting leaks for Amazon's series was Morfydd Clark, who was slated to play a younger version of the elven Lady Galadriel. This brings up the intriguing question of what Galadriel was up to several thousand years before she shows Frodo her mirror and spazzes out when he offers her the One Ring.
All shall love me and despair.
She may look young, but Galadriel is one of the oldest beings in all of Middle-earth. By the time of the Second Age, she's already thousands of years old and married to her husband, Celeborn. The Lord and Lady bounce around, living with various elvish communities throughout the entire Second Age. While the specifics of their story can get a bit confusing, eventually, they cross the Misty Mountains and relocate to Lothlorien, but not as its rulers. The elvish power couple continues to have a heavy influence on the affairs of the age, and Galadriel is eventually given her own elven ring, which she uses to keep her new home safe and prosperous. At some point, she also gives birth to their daughter Celebrion, who becomes the wife of Elrond and the mother of Arwen. While Galadriel and Celeborn's time to truly shine won't come until the Third Age, there's no doubt they're some of the primary movers and shakers of the Second Age as well. So far, we've talked a lot about elvish events, but the Second Age is actually mostly focused on the affairs of men. While men have been around for quite a while by this point, there's one kingdom in particular that really defines the Second Age, the island nation of Numenor. After the destructive War of Wrath, the Valar, the guardian spirits of Middle-earth, raise a giant star-shaped island out of the ocean as a gift to the men who fought against Morgoth. The island and the nation that eventually settles on it come to define the Second Age. The first men to settle on the island are led by their king Elros, the brother of Elrond. Due to some very convoluted family history, the two brothers and their children are given the choice to live out their lives as either immortal elves or mortal men. While Elrond becomes an immortal elvish lord, Elros becomes the first very mortal king of Numenor, where he rules for a little over 400 years. Throughout the Second Age, the island nation remains a force to be reckoned with and a central part of Tolkien's narrative. At the end of the First Age, the Dark Lord Morgoth is permanently banished from Middle-earth. However, many of his servants survive, including the Balrog that fights Gandalf in Moria, and Sauron, the evil spirit that would eventually become the Lord of the Rings, was the second in command under the Dark Lord during the First Age, and after Morgoth is banished, Sauron himself becomes the Dark Lord. Stepping into the power vacuum left by his master, Sauron becomes the main enemy of the entire Second and Third Ages. Roughly 1,000 years into the Second Age, he establishes Mordor as his chief base of operations and begins making plans.
One does not simply walk into Mordor.
But we're not talking about Sauron the Flaming Eyeball here, nor about the towering dude in black armor. At this point in history, Sauron still looks pretty good. Rather than attacking his elvish enemies, the Dark Lord capitalizes on his still attractive physical form, calls himself Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, and begins pretending to offer his friendship to any elves that would listen to him this side of the Misty Mountains. Sauron as Annatar spends the next few centuries worming his way into the affections of the elves of Middle-earth, while a few of the elvish lords like Elrond and Galadriel don't trust him. Most of the rest of the elves do. One group of elves, the same one that lives near the dwarves in Khazad-dûm, becomes particularly enchanted by the Dark Lord in disguise. They're led by a fellow named Celebrimbor, and they're famous for being incredible craftsmen. With Annatar's help, they begin to learn how to forge rings of power. It's at this point that Sauron secretly forges the One Ring. He pours a ton of his power into the ring in order to use it to control the other rings. When he puts the One Ring on, though, the elves instantly realize that they've been duped and take their rings off in order to avoid his domination. Angry at the fact that his ring gave him away before he was ready, Sauron prepares to subdue the elves the old-fashioned way, with a war. Once Sauron's real intentions are revealed, he demands the other rings of power, claiming that the elves never would have been able to make them without his help, which is technically true, with the exception of the 3 elven rings. Of course, feeling betrayed, the elves refuse to hand over any of their powerful jewelry. With his pretext for war in hand, Sauron attacks the free people of Middle-earth in a bloody war that lasts for several years and nearly leads to the villain's total domination of the bulk of the continent. Initially, Celebrimbor and his people are destroyed. The dwarves retreat to Moria, and Elrond flees north to found Rivendell. The Dark Lord also captures the 7 rings that eventually would go to the dwarves, and the 9 rings that would eventually be given to the Black Riders. Critically, the 3 elven rings remain hidden. Just as Sauron is preparing to do a victory lap through Middle-earth, the Númenóreans suddenly arrive, sending the Dark Lord scampering back to Mordor with little more than a bodyguard. This saves the elves, men, and dwarves from total destruction. Over the next several centuries, the Númenóreans and Sauron continue to build up their strength and jockey for power in Middle-earth. Sauron spends the next millennia rebuilding his strength. He completes his tower of Barad-dûr, the one where he resides later as a flaming eye, distributes the rings of power, and sets up the Black Riders as his terrifying new servants. He continues to dominate practically everything in sight, with the crucial exception of the elven kingdoms he failed to conquer and a few strong but scattered settlements of the Númenóreans along the coast of Middle-earth. Eventually, Sauron declares that he is the king of men, a move that is insulting to the very manly, certainly unconquered Númenóreans. The Númenórean king Ar-Pharazôn the Golden invades Middle-earth with such a resplendent army that Sauron's minions abandon him without a fight. At this point, Sauron, who still looks like the attractive Annatar, willingly surrenders to the Númenóreans and becomes their hostage. This may come across as a cowardly move on the surface, but it ultimately spells doom for the Númenóreans. They bring the Dark Lord back to their island nation, and it doesn't take long before the prisoner begins working his bewitchments on the king himself. Once in a position of power, Sauron begins convincing the king's subjects to worship Morgoth, complete with human sacrifices. Sauron ultimately convinces the king of Númenor to attack the Valar and their land far to the west in a delusional attempt to gain immortality. This is clearly an issue, and it becomes one of the rare cases in Middle-earth history when the supreme god Eru Ilúvatar himself comes down to intervene. Eru destroys the rebellious king's armada of ships and sinks the insurgent island in an Atlantis-like catastrophe. Interestingly, it's at this point in Tolkien's mythology that the Earth is literally reshaped from a flat plane to a round sphere. Sauron himself is caught in the chaos, and while his spirit survives and heads back to Middle-earth, his body is destroyed. The Second Age narrative tends to revolve mostly around elves, men, and their ongoing wars with Sauron. However, it's also one of the most prosperous eras in all of dwarven history. The primary dwarven city in Middle-earth at this time is Khazad-dûm. At this point, though, there isn't a Balrog haunting the mines yet, and the subterranean city is alive with dwarven life and activity. In addition, the city becomes even more rich and famous after many talented dwarves from the eastern dwarven mansions flee west at the end of the First Age. During the Second Age, the dwarves strike up a particularly friendly relationship with a neighboring group of elves that live right next to their western gates.
Speak, friend, and enter.
These are the same elves that end up making the great rings of power that the One Ring is designed to control, and the two highly skilled races get along swimmingly for a long time. Eventually, when this kingdom of elves is attacked by Sauron, the dwarves will try to help their friends. Unfortunately, they come too little and too late, and end up retreating and locking themselves up in Khazad-dûm, where they stay out of most of the rest of the major events of the age. The last 2.5 centuries of the Second Age focus on the founding of two important kingdoms, one of which any Lord of the Rings fan should recognize. We're talking about Arnor and Gondor, the two kingdoms founded by a group of faithful Númenóreans who rejected Sauron's silver-tongued lies and survived the destruction of their home by sailing away before the catastrophic chaos erupted. When they arrive in Middle-earth, they join forces with the elves and settle down to a new life. These are the same people that build, among many other things, Saruman's Tower of Orthanc, the city of Minas Tirith, and the Tower at Weathertop. They also bring with them the White Tree that can be seen in The Return of the King, as well as the Palantiri, the shiny seeing stones that Saruman uses to chat with Sauron. Everything looks hunky-dory for the two new kingdoms, until Sauron shows up in Middle-earth again.
I see.
When they realize that Sauron has returned to Mordor, the exiled Númenóreans name the fiery mountain in his land Mount Doom. Yes, that Mount Doom. Not long after this, Sauron begins attacking his enemies yet again, and the elves, men, dwarves, and all other free peoples in Middle-earth join together to form the Last Alliance. The initial sequence in the Fellowship of the Ring centers on this last alliance, showing the war in which Sauron is destroyed, the ring is cut from his finger, and Isildur tragically refuses to destroy it in the fires of Mount Doom.
Destroy it!
No.
Isildur!
These moments at the beginning of the monumental Jackson trilogy mark the end of the Second Age. Not only does the era dovetail neatly with the existing cinematic source material, but it leaves a massive helping of epic stories for the folks at Amazon to dig into.
Everything you ever knew about The Lord of the Rings is a lie. Why did Peter Jackson change so much from the books? Keep watching to find out. Perhaps the biggest misconception regarding the world of Middle-earth is that hobbits are, as a race, pretty weak. Sure, Bilbo and Frodo are heroic, but most fans think of them as exceptions from the norm. However, the truth is that hobbits can be quite sturdy and quite fierce. This is most evident in a key part of The Return of the King that is actually omitted from the cinematic adaptation, where a deep-powered Saruman leads a group of human ruffians to take over the Shire. When Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin return home, they lead a revolt and drive off the humans. In fact, when nearly 100 humans come to try to reclaim the Shire, 70 of them are killed in combat with the hobbits, many of them cut down by axes. Why then did Peter Jackson omit this from his hit movie, other than a brief glimpse and a vision during the Fellowship of the Ring? It's possible that the universe would collapse under the weight of yet another ending being added to that movie, so the hobbits get a more traditional happy ending. One of the misconceptions about The Lord of the Rings is that Samwise Gamgee is little more than a source of comedic relief and funny memes.
Potatoes! Boil 'em, mash 'em, stick 'em in a stew.
However, the most badass Samwise Gamgee moment is one that is very easy to miss. When Sam thinks that Frodo has been killed by Shelob, the giant spider, Sam takes the ring to continue the quest alone. If that wasn't badass enough, once he saves Frodo, he just gives the ring back. Why is this a big deal? There are almost no other instances of the ring being freely given away. Remember, it's a huge deal when Bilbo does it at the start of the trilogy, and at the end of the tale, Gollum inadvertently saves the day when he nibbles it off of Frodo, because as it turns out, Frodo himself was unable to willingly give it up. A common criticism of Lord of the Rings is the fact that Gandalf didn't just summon some of those giant birds to carry the Fellowship to Mordor. The truth is that using the great eagles in that way was never an option. First, there's no reason to think Sauron wouldn't be ready for an enemy to approach Mordor from the air. Remember all those Nazgul on their big dragons? Until Sauron was defeated, the eagles couldn't easily get into Mordor. Second, it's a flawed assumption that Gandalf could summon the great eagles at will. Gandalf did not summon the great eagles, they came of their own accord. Tolkien often portrays animals in his stories as being blessed with as much intelligence as humans. As early as the great eagle's first appearance in The Hobbit, writer j.r.r. Tolkien made it clear that the great eagles did not like most two-legged things and would rarely get involved with them. They respected Gandalf and would occasionally help him, but they were never at his command, even to save Middle-earth from Sauron. Another misconception about Lord of the Rings that can be blamed entirely on the movies is that losing the ring leads to instant aging.
You haven't aged there.
This is dramatized by the extreme contrast of Bilbo's relative youth at the beginning of the first movie, when he is celebrating turning 111 years old, and his extremely elderly appearance when they encounter him in Rivendell. Now, the movies are deliberately cagey about the timeline, but the books tell us that 17 years pass between that birthday celebration and Frodo's quest. And then more years pass after the quest before Bilbo's ship leaves. In that time, Bilbo has seemingly aged quite a few decades, leading some fans to conclude that losing the ring caused him to age. However, this is canonically the opposite of the truth, and we know this because of Gollum. Gollum was pushing 600 years old by the time he died, and he had been without the ring for over 60 years by the time that happened. If losing the ring leads to the body's age catching up, Gollum should have been dust well before the Fellowship of the Ring even began. Among die-hard Lord of the Rings fans, there are 4 words almost guaranteed to instigate a blind rage: elves at Helm's Deep. This, of course, was a major part of the climax of the Two Towers movie, with a small company of elves arriving to help the beleaguered humans drive off an entire host of invading orcs. And because these are adaptations of a beloved series of books, many people figured this, too, was in the books. But not only was this event not in the books, it was canonically impossible in the books. Peter Jackson made the bold decision to start his film adaptations by showing audiences a pivotal moment in the history of Middle-earth: humans and elves standing together to defeat Sauron. This was notable not just because they defeated Sauron, but because this was the last alliance between the two races. They went back to each doing their own thing, and by the time the main events of the modern plot unfold, the elves are fading in prominence from Middle-earth. Remember, it's actually a major plot point that big, important Elrond has assembled a team of humans, hobbits, a dwarf, and a wizard. The elves are supposed to be leaving this world behind and letting the mortal races deal with their own problems. So having elves show up at Helm's Deep violates a major theme of the entire series. While books are perfect places for allusions and metaphors, it is the job of the movie to visually spell everything out. Peter Jackson took his role very seriously when it came to Return of the King, leading to one of our primary misconceptions, that Sauron is a giant eyeball. When audiences first see Sauron, he is a towering warrior in the flashback battle sequence at the beginning of Fellowship of the Ring. When they next see him, though, he is seemingly a giant eye, one that Aragorn resolves to distract with a flashy battle sequence while Sam and Frodo finish their task. This giant eyeball is a creation made especially for the movies, and it makes many people think that the eye is literally Sauron. However, Tolkien's own letters clarify that Sauron had a physical body by the time the ring was physically destroyed, something hinted at in the Hobbit prequel films. Thanks to Viggo Mortensen and the face that launched 1,000 fanfics, it's easy to take Aragorn's age for granted. After all, Mortensen was 43 years old when Fellowship of the Ring came out, and it seemed a reasonable age for a seasoned warrior who can still kick orcish ass. However, the character of Aragorn is supposed to be twice that age at the time of their adventures. There's even a deleted scene where Eowyn is highly confused when Aragorn tells her that he fought in battle alongside her grandfather.
Then you must be at least 60. 70? You cannot be 80.
So what's up with this exceptionally old age? Aragorn was not like mortal men, as he was Isildur's heir, was the last of the Númenóreans, a group of humans with exceptionally long life whose homeland was destroyed in an Atlantis-style cataclysm long ago. This is part of the tragic history the character often bears with him, and is part of his concern that he may repeat some of the same errors that his ancestors did. One of the most powerful moments from Return of the King is when Eowyn, the Shield Maiden, defeats the Witch King. The Witch King feels quite confident because of a prophecy that no man can kill him, at which point Eowyn, disguised as a male warrior, reveals that she is a woman and stabs him in the face.
I am no man.
But Merry deserves just as much credit. Before Éowyn gets her awesome killing stroke in, audiences see Merry stab the Witch King with his blade. The movies gloss over the importance of these blades, with Aragorn simply handing them out at Weathertop. The books, however, made clear that Merry's blade was forged with magical enchantments, specifically made to hurt the Witch King. Thus, Merry happens to stab the Witch King with one of the only weapons that can hurt him, opening the door for Éowyn to complete the prophecy. Gandalf is a wizard, yes, but he's actually not the kind of wizard we're used to. Gandalf isn't a wizard in the same way that, say, Harry Potter is a wizard. He's not someone who showed aptitude for magic as a child, and so was sent to some wizard school and given a big tome and taught a bunch of spells. No, Gandalf was created as a wizard and sent to Middle-earth to protect it. The Valar were essentially the gods of Middle-earth, and they sent Gandalf there, along with Saruman, Radagast, and 2 other wizards. These 5 wizards acted as agents of the gods. They were made to look human and given magical and physical abilities beyond normal men. They existed for millennia, even longer than the elves. This is why Gandalf knows so much. It's why no matter where the Fellowship goes, he's already been there and always seems to know someone. He's been alive long enough to travel to every corner of Middle-earth and back again hundreds of times over. And it's why, after he dies during his battle with the Balrog, Gandalf returns to life, because the gods resurrected him to complete his mission to redeem the world from the devil called Sauron. Denethor was portrayed as a vengeful and cowardly madman in Peter Jackson's Return of the King. John Noble played Denethor to perfection, but there was a lot of information missing from the movie that would have added more depth to the character. In the novel, Tolkien makes it clear that Denethor was actually driven mad by an outside magical influence, by a Palantir. This is the same sort of magic orb that also corrupted Saruman and almost possessed Pippin, as it opens the user to Sauron's influence. While Denethor ultimately failed as steward, his fall is tragic. He was the leader of a besieged kingdom searching for a way to stop an unbeatable enemy. He failed, and the consequence was madness, but he went mad trying to save his people, and that's got to count for something. Peter Jackson's adaptation of Return of the King may give you the impression that Gondor was the only place where Sauron's armies laid siege, but that was far from true. This is alluded to briefly in the extended version of Return of the King when Legolas tells Gimli he believes the dwarves are busy with their own battles, but we don't hear any specifics. The appendices of Lord of the Rings make it clear that at the same time Sauron's armies were smashing into the walls of Minas Tirith, the elves, dwarves, and other humans of Greater Middle-earth were dealing with their own invasions. Sauron's armies in Dol Guldur, the abandoned city where Gandalf, Saruman, and Galadriel encounter Sauron in the Hobbit movies, attacked Lorien 3 times. Once Sauron was finally defeated, Galadriel traveled to the city and destroyed it. The Wood Elves were also waging war against the orcs in their own forests, and eventually they managed to expel them. The humans of Dale, the city at the foot of the Lonely Mountain in The Hobbit, weren't as successful as the elves, though they were aided by the dwarves. Sauron's armies attacked Dale and overwhelmed its defenders. Humans and dwarves alike took shelter in the Lonely Mountain, and the orcs laid siege to its gates. Once the One Ring was destroyed, the combined armies of humans and dwarves were able to rout the orcs, but not before both the human and dwarven kings were killed. Though he ultimately betrays Frodo and the Fellowship after being corrupted by the One Ring's power, Tolkien makes it clear in his novel that Boromir is actually a noble warrior. He's one of the most skilled swordsmen in the Fellowship, and possibly the strongest. In battle scenes, he performs better than most, with the possible exception of Aragorn. He's flawed, but he's not the mess of nerves Peter Jackson depicted in Fellowship of the Rings. Except for his last stand, Boromir is hardly seen in Jackson's Fellowship battle scenes, but the extended edition of the film revealed a number of cutscenes and lines that showed him in a better light. In a Lothlorien scene, for example, when the rest of the Fellowship is silent, Boromir is the only one to reach out and tell Frodo not to blame himself for Gandalf's presumed death.
Gandalf's death was not in vain. Nor would he have you give up hope.
Like his father, Boromir wasn't a bad guy at all. He was just a desperate man who lost hope while trying to save his people. Many fans were quite annoyed by the film portrayal of Faramir. This is because it led to this kind of widespread assumption that Faramir is like Boromir Light. That is, he's just another corrupt and greedy human who is eager for glory and power, and he only changes his mind at the 11th hour. However, the Faramir of the books is the polar opposite of Boromir. Through a combination of intelligent interrogation and Sam's inability to keep his mouth shut, he finds out that they are carrying a powerful weapon against Sauron, one that Boromir greatly desired for humanity to have. And when the Faramir of the books finds this out, he merely reiterates his promise to help the hobbits out because he had made a vow, unlike Peter Jackson's version, who initially decides to turn them over to Dad to score some points. Not cool. At some point, it just became an unquestioned truth that hobbit feet, along with being hairy and necessarily resilient, are disproportionately large. Like if you took a clown and magically turned his floppy clown shoes into exceptionally hairy feet, that's what hobbit feet look like in the films. The truth is that Tolkien never wrote anything about hobbit feet being particularly large. In Fellowship of the Ring, he wrote that hobbit feet had, quote, tough leathery soles, and that they were, quote, clad in a thick curling hair, much like the hair of their heads. But he made no mention about their feet being particularly large. Sean Astin, who played Samwise Gamgee in Peter Jackson's adaptations, would likely have preferred a more faithful interpretation. In the A Day in the Life of a Hobbit special feature on the extended edition of Fellowship of the Ring, director Peter Jackson revealed that Astin, annoyed at the time it took to apply the Hobbit foot prosthetics, kept Jackson up to date on his personal tally of how many days the prosthetics were applied versus how many days the feet appeared in shots.
We have to be really honest and say that when the days that we don't have feet, we're really excited.
Partly due to the enduring popularity of The Lord of the Rings, elves remain a staple of high fantasy, and their physical appearance tends to follow specific rules. They're all stunningly beautiful creatures with men and women sporting equally long and often blonde hair, and they have pointy ears. But Tolkien never wrote that blonde hair was a dominant feature of his elves. In fact, many of them, such as Elrond and Arwen, have black hair. Though Legolas is almost always portrayed as having blonde hair, Tolkien never actually describes his hair color. Legolas's father, Thranduil, however, is one of the few elves to explicitly be described as blonde. Tolkien also never wrote anything to the effect of elf men having the same straight long hair as women, so that a bunch of elf men and women together look like a line of actors waiting for a shampoo commercial audition. In fact, believe it or not, Tolkien never even wrote in any of his books that elf ears were pointy. Maybe he never meant for them to be thought of as pointy, or maybe he thought elves were common enough in legend and myth that the detail wasn't needed. Regardless, unless someone shows Tolkien's elves baking cookies and trees for Keebler or making toys for Santa, we can probably all agree they've gotten a pretty good deal in pop culture so far, and don't have a lot to complain about.
In the many decades since it was first published, The Lord of the Rings has remained one of the world's most popular novel series, and Peter Jackson's iconic movie trilogy has only made the story endure that much longer. Being so popular, of course, you're bound to get a few crazy fan theories thrown into the mix. Here are a few of the Lord of the Rings series that, if true, would turn the whole of Middle-earth on its head. Even casual Tolkien fans will have heard of one of the story's most notorious criticisms. To keep it short, why didn't the Fellowship just use the eagles to fly to Mount Doom and destroy the ring? On the surface, it seems like a fair question to ask, and there are plenty of perfectly reasonable answers to it too. But one fan theory in particular goes beyond just explaining why the eagles weren't up for the task. It actually suggests that using them as transport was the plan all along. This theory suggests that, after being saved by the eagles from his imprisonment on top of Orthanc, Gandalf decides that this wing transportation is surely the best way to catch Sauron by surprise and destroy the ring. The crux of this theory rests on the suggestion that when Gandalf the Grey engages in combat with the Balrog, his now iconic final line should be taken literally.
Fly, you fools!
The idea is that he's just not telling his companions to get out of Moria, he's trying to communicate his plan to use the eagles to reach Mordor. Of course, this doesn't work, and by the time he returns as Gandalf the White, he's got a whole new agenda to pursue. Of course, Gandalf could also have just been telling the Fellowship to quit their dawdling and get the heck out of Dodge. Just go with whatever works for you. Smeagol is one of the most pitiful characters from The Lord of the Rings, and in a way, one of the most lovable too. Anyone with a heart should be able to feel for the poor wretch as he struggles with his centuries-long obsession with a powerful force beyond his own comprehension. Then, of course, there's Gollum, the other side of his split personality in the films. Gollum basically represents all the bad stuff. He's hateful, violent, and willing to stop at nothing to get hold of his precious ring. While most people generally accept that these two characters make up a kind of multiple personality disorder on Smeagol's part, one fan fan theory suggests a wholly different take. Rather than simply writing off Gollum as Smeagol's evil side, this theory goes out on a limb and claims that Gollum is a legitimate personality all its own, that stems from within the One Ring itself. This theory rests on the fact that when Bilbo has possession of the ring, he acts very similarly to Smeagol's Gollum personality. Towards the end of the story, Frodo begins to act this way too. In short, anyone tempted by the ring, and not just Smeagol, can exhibit snippets of this identity, and upon giving into the ring's dominance, would themselves be completely consumed by it. It would have happened to Bilbo, it almost happened to Frodo, and it'd probably happen to you too. During the opening chapters of The Fellowship of the Ring, it's revealed that Frodo's parents drowned in a boating incident. While this was officially an accident, darker rumors suggested that his mother actually tried to push his father into the water, and he pulled her in with him. Accident or not, that was the story as far as everyone knew it, until now. According to one Reddit fan theory, the given story of this so-called accident is actually a misdirect. Instead, the theory proposes that it was none other than Gollum himself who killed his future master's parents as they coasted along the water after dinner in the moonlight. While the poster admits that the coincidence would have been a stretch, they do make some solid arguments for their theory. For one thing, Gollum was searching around for his lost ring at the time of Frodo's parents' death, still looking for Bilbo Baggins of the Shire. Frodo's father was named Drogo Baggins, so who's to say the villainous creature didn't simply bump off the first Baggins he ran across? Unable to find the ring on Drogo's body, Gollum could have then headed south, drawn towards the One Ring's master. While it takes a little stretching to fit with Tolkien's narrative, this theory does throw up the tantalizing prospect of a version of the story in which Frodo discovers that the creature who benefited so frequently from his mercy actually killed his own parents. Okay, so this theory is kind of a twofer. Let's start with a more clear-cut one, that Tolkien included cannibalism in his trilogy. More specifically, the idea that Grima Wormtongue ate Hobbit flesh. During the Scouring of the Shire chapter in The Return of the King, Saruman reveals that his lackey Wormtongue killed Frodo's corrupt relative Lotho. During this scene, the fallen wizard states, "Worm killed your chief. Stabbed him in his sleep, I believe. Buried him, I hope. Though Worm has been very hungry lately." And this is that last little zinger that has led many to question if Wormtongue actually straight up ate Lotho's body in an attempt to stave off his extreme hunger. If he did, this kind of mistreatment on Saruman's part would go a long way in explaining what pushed Wormtongue into finally snapping and killing his master. Cannibalism aside, however, another theory suggests that the idea that Saruman's mistreatment of Wormtongue wasn't just turning him into the pale, decrepit wretch that he became. It was actually transforming him into an orc. In other words, after creating his hybrid or Akai earlier in the story, it's possible that Saruman was experimenting once more, this time with warping a man into an entirely new breed of orc. It's a chilling thought that could have had drastic repercussions for Middle-earth, if Wormtongue hadn't been killed before the transition could fully take place. Here's another Wormtongue theory, though this one is at least a little less grotesque. This theory has to do with the Rings of Power, but not the ones you'll have encountered before. Instead, it tackles the idea that Saruman might have attempted to craft rings of his own. After all, Saruman emulated the Dark Lord in most of the things that he did, so why not make rings of his own too? There are multiple instances in the trilogy where it's suggested that Saruman has an interest in the other Rings of Power. When Gandalf tells the story of his captivity at the Council of Elrond, for instance, he specifically points out that he'd noticed that Saruman was wearing a ring. On top of that, when Saruman announces his treachery to Gandalf, he refers to himself as Saruman Ringmaker. If you can assume from these hints that Saruman was busy making his own ring, then why would he stop at making one for himself? Wouldn't he want to take after Sauron and create other rings to use as a tool for the domination of others, the same way Sauron took control of the Nazgul? What's more, this theory suggests that none other than Grima Wormtongue is in possession of one of Saruman's rings, forcing him to serve his wizardly master without question until the very end. Fans of the Lord of the Rings books will be very familiar with Tom Bombadil. This enigma of a character is a mysterious and unspeakably powerful being that lives out in the Old Forest, just beyond the edge of the Shire. Now, Tom has no interest in the affairs of outsiders, or the war going on in Middle-earth. Well, that's what he says at least. One theory, however, suggests that Tom Bombadil is none other than the Witch King himself. Okay, don't laugh too hard before you hear at least a few of the arguments in favor of this theory. For instance, when the hobbits run into the merry old fellow in the Fellowship of the Ring, Tom has a noticeable glint in his eye when the Black Riders are mentioned. And then there's the fact that he can see Frodo clearly when the hobbit is wearing the One Ring, just like the Witch King at Weathertop. And when Tom puts a magical piece of jewelry on his own finger, it has no effect on him. Much in the same way that it wouldn't have any effect on a true servant of Sauron either. Of course, if by some crazy happenstance this theory were to be true, it would mean Frodo was saved and looked after by the Witch King for a considerable chunk of time, which, all things considered, seems unlikely. Early on in the Two Towers, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli chase a troop of orcs and Uruk-hai that have captured their Hobbit friends, Merry and Pippin. Eventually, they discover their enemies have been destroyed and the Hobbits are missing. As they prepare to head into the forest of Fangorn to search for them, they run into an interesting character, in the book at least. As they sit resting by a fire in the dark, they suddenly spot an old bent man leaning on a staff and wrapped in a great cloak, with his wide-brimmed hat pulled down over his eyes. Before the trio can react, the man disappears without a trace. When they meet Gandalf shortly afterward, he clarifies that it wasn't him, and so it must have been Saruman. However, one theory suggests that it was none other than Radagast the Brown. The giveaway? There's little to no proof anywhere that Saruman ever wears a hat. The Brown Wizard, on the other hand, frequently does. Radagast plays a significant part in the Hobbit trilogy and makes a brief appearance in the book version of Fellowship of the Ring. But if this theory is true, it would indicate that Radagast was more active during the War of the Ring than anyone could have guessed. It's strange to think of three heads as particularly enticing, but in the Fellowship of the Ring, that's all Gimli asks for when Galadriel offers him a parting gift. On the surface, this present seems cute enough, if a little odd. But Gimli isn't the first person to want in on Galadriel's golden tresses. Way back in the First Age, the elf lord Fëanor requested a strand of hair from Galadriel 3 times. It was often said by the elves that the light of the lost 2 trees of Valinor had endured in Galadriel's hair, and this inspired Fëanor to create the legendary jewels known as the Silmarils. But Fëanor was turned down repeatedly and never got his hands on even a single strand of Galadriel's hair. For her to then bestow 3 hairs on Gimli is a seriously big deal, especially since Gimli is a dwarf, part of a race that doesn't exactly get along well with the elves. All of this has inspired a theory that the 3 hairs are actually the great opening gesture in an act of diplomacy, peace, and reconciliation between the 2 races. The fact that Galadriel decides he's more worthy of this gift than one of the greatest elf lords who's ever lived is one heck of a statement. And if Gimli eventually managed to set the 3 golden hairs in imperishable crystal, as he claimed, it may have ultimately precipitated a lasting peace between elves and dwarves. For all its faults, the Hobbit trilogy could be pretty fun. It was exciting too, some of the time, and you can't say it wasn't colourful, but let's be honest, it was also a bit of a train wreck. For all of its overstuffed storylines, lengthy battle scenes, and ridiculous CGI, one brilliant theorist has suggested an explanation that fixes the entire fiasco with a clever twist. It's all a tall tale from Bilbo's perspective. See, over the course of his life, Bilbo developed something of a love for storytelling.
Turn them all to stone.
And he's not afraid of embellishing these stories from time to time either. At the Council of Elrond, when asked to tell his story, he has to start with the caveat that it's actually the true story, saying, "If some have heard me tell it otherwise, I ask them to forget it and forgive me." In short, Bilbo loves to exaggerate his stories, and the Hobbit films are actually a depiction of Tolkien's classic novel from Mr. Baggins' own perspective. Talk about a useful cop-out.
Immortal being, daughter of Elrond, wife of Aragorn, and queen of Gondor. Arwen the Elf lived quite a long and adventurous life, even before Frodo and friends stumbled into her neck of the woods in Fellowship of the Ring. Here's Arwen's entire backstory explained. Ancestry is often a key part of what defines a person's path in life, and with Arwen, it's essential. Right from birth, her lineage, both in the recent and distant past, makes her a prime candidate for the Middle-earth limelight. Let's start with the familiar faces first. Arwen's dad is Elrond. As the leader of Rivendell, a venerable warrior, and a famous counselor, Arwen's father is practically always at the center of the continent's politics and wars, and his daughter is often by his side in Rivendell, observing the action. And then there's Arwen's maternal grandmother, Galadriel. The Lady of the Golden Wood is about as old as an elf can get, and she's witnessed nearly all of Middle-earth's long, dramatic history. She has incredible power, wields an elven ring, and is one of Sauron's chief enemies. While having Elrond and Galadriel as her family members is already enough to set Arwen up as a pretty important she-elf, the hereditary connections don't stop there. Arwen's family history is studded with famous people, particularly through her father. Elrond's father is Arendil the Mariner, the half-elf, half-man hero that saves the good guys from destruction at the end of the First Age of Middle-earth history. On top of that, Elrond's mother is Elwing, the granddaughter of the man Beren, and the half-elven, half-angelic Luthien, the power couple in one of Tolkien's most famous First Age epics. And the thing is, we're only touching on the most famous of her relatives here. There are several others who play critical roles in Tolkien's other writings, especially the Silmarillion. Suffice it to say, Arwen is the Middle-earth equivalent of the offspring of a marriage between a rock star and a Hollywood celebrity. For those of you who didn't notice, she's also descended from men, elves, and the angelic Maiar, giving her and her immediate family a unique connection to all three races. According to the appendix of The Return of the King, Arwen is born 241 years into the Third Age. That makes her approximately 2,778 years old by the time the One Ring is destroyed, which isn't terribly old for an elf. In comparison, Galadriel is over 8,000. However, it does give her a good step up on her future husband's 88-year lifespan. When Arwen is born, the world is relatively peaceful, a few hundred years away from the epic war of the Last Alliance. That's the event depicted in the opening sequence of the Fellowship of the Ring, where men, elves, and dwarves join together to resist Sauron's first run at conquering the continent. When the dust settles, the Dark Lord is defeated. The ring has been cut from his hand, and Middle-earth settles down for a long period of relative peace and prosperity. The primary thing to point out during these early centuries of Arwen's life is the fact that, while the power of men grows in Middle-earth, the elves and dwarves slowly begin to fade into obscurity. And that's not to say that they're inconsequential. Places like Lothlorien, Rivendell, and Khazad-dûm are still powerful and influential. However, they stop trending up at this point in time, and, if anything, begin to lose the larger political and military power that they once had. Her people may have been slowly fading, but the first few thousand years of Arwen's life are ones of peaceful comfort. She spends a lot of her time bouncing between Rivendell and Lothlorien with her grandparents. In The Return of the King, she even casually mentions that she'd been in Lothlorien for a while. While there aren't a ton of details on Arwen's early activity, the bulk of her time for the greater part of 3,000 years seems to have been spent following this pattern of living in one of the two elven havens, or traveling between them. In addition to her famous father and grandmother, Arwen also has two older twin brothers, Elladan and Elrohir, as well as a mother named Celebrion. However, over time, she sees each of these familial connections less often, primarily due to a tragic event that happens to her mother. About 500 years before the War of the Ring, tragedy strikes the family when their mother is captured by orcs in the Misty Mountains. She's eventually found and rescued by her sons, but by then, she's been tortured and poisoned. A devastated Elrond manages to save her life, showing a glimpse of the skill that he later uses to save Frodo from his deadly knife wound. However, Celebrion is so traumatized by the experience that she never fully recovers her former health, and eventually decides to leave Middle-earth to seek peace and healing in the Blessed Realm, the same place that Frodo sails to at the end of The Return of the King. After this experience, Arwen's brothers become especially bitter towards the orcs, and spend much of their time out hunting their foes, often teaming up with the Rangers in the process. Eventually, this morbid hobby even leads to their being present when Aragorn's father is killed by orcs, making his young son chieftain in the process. And that serves as the perfect segue to finally introduce Arwen's bow. Soon after one of Arwen's trips back from Rivendell, she decides to take a walk, and who should appear on the path in front of her but a young man? Tell everyone who the young man is, Legolas.
This is no mere ranger. He is Aragorn, son of Arathorn.
At this point, he's a 20-year-old stripling who's over the moon because he just found out that he's the chieftain of the Dúnedain and the heir to the throne of Gondor. When the two meet, it's love at first sight, at least for Aragorn. Arwen is little more than amused by his head-over-heels attraction to her beauty. Nevertheless, Aragorn sets his heart on pursuing the Elvish maiden, which quickly leads to a gentle but stern confrontation with Elrond. The lore master sadly prophesies to the young ranger that Arwen will only marry him if he becomes king, and that in either case, either she or Aragorn will eventually be heartbroken by the situation.
If Sauron is defeated and Aragorn made king and all that you hope for comes true, you will still have to taste the bitterness of mortality.
The budding relationship between Arwen and Aragorn brings up an interesting question. Are the two related? The short answer is, well, yes. In fact, in Return of the King, when we learn how they met and Aragorn explains who he is, Arwen's immediate response is that we are kin from afar. However, while their bloodlines are related, it's definitely a very, very distant connection. Elrond's brother is a man, and we mean literally a man, named Elros. With their unique family history, the brothers and their descendants are allowed to choose between either an immortal or a mortal life. While Elrond chooses immortality, his brother opts for mortality and ends up leading a nation of men called Númenor. Over time, that nation becomes one of Sauron's chief enemies, and eventually, it's the Númenorians who set up the two kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor. When Arnor collapses, its royal bloodline secretly survives through the Rangers and their line of chieftains, the last of whom is Aragorn. In other words, there are dozens of generations between Arwen and Aragorn, making them technically but extremely distantly related. Considering the fact that Tolkien came from a world where English royalty was constantly intermarrying with first and second cousins, the magnitude of the distance in Aragorn and Arwen's relationship would hardly have seemed to be much of a concern. Over time, Aragorn makes his case to Arwen in a convincing yet indirect way. When he discovers that he doesn't have a shot with Elrond's daughter at present, the Ranger leaves Rivendell and heads out into the wide world to forge his own path. In the ensuing decades, the exiled king proves himself over and over again. He travels in the wild, fights in disguise in Rohan and Gondor, befriends Gandalf, and even makes a solo trip far into the mysterious eastern and southern regions of the continent. Over this time, the son of Arathorn evolves from an inexperienced young man to a battle-hardened warrior. He gains wisdom and experience beyond his years. Years that quickly add up. While still a drop in the bucket, the next time he meets Arwen, Aragorn is around 50 years old. This time, they hook up in Lothlorien, and it's Arwen who's surprised to see Aragorn walking towards her through the trees. They spend a season together, and Arwen officially falls in love with the now mature, exiled king. By the time they part ways, they've committed to marrying each other, and Elrond gives his sad approval, though he clarifies that his daughter will marry no one less than the king of Arnor and Gondor. After she's officially betrothed to Aragorn, Arwen spends most of the next few decades in Rivendell as things ramp up to the War of the Ring. Once the war breaks out, her role varies depending on if you're reading the books or watching the movies. Arwen remains more or less on the sidelines throughout the book series. However, just because she's out of sight doesn't mean she's out of mind. In fact, Aragorn is depicted thinking of her on multiple occasions. For instance, when the Fellowship arrives in Lothlorien, Frodo sees the Ranger wrapped in a memory in the same place where he and Arwen got engaged. In addition to remembrances, Arwen meets with Aragorn when he arrives with the hobbits in Rivendell. She also personally makes an enormous banner that Aragorn unveils during the Battle of Pelennor Fields, using it to officially announce his return as the king. Arwen's role was dramatically beefed up for Peter Jackson's trilogy. The she-elf helps Frodo escape from the Black Riders, revives a waterlogged Aragorn via a vision, and is repeatedly shown struggling with her father's desire for her to leave Middle-earth rather than become mortal. Even in this enhanced role, though, Arwen's participation in the plot is actually reduced from the original cinematic scripts. In an interview with IGN, Liv Tyler herself clarified that the character was supposed to be much more heavily involved in the story. In an earlier version of the script, she was actually supposed to lead the elf contingent that fights at Helm's Deep in the Two Towers. However, as they shot the movie, the filmmakers realized that inserting Arwen into the violent action wasn't doing justice to her character. Tyler herself points out that you don't have to put a sword in a woman's hand to make her seem tough. That's little actual makeup of who Arwen is, and her sheer will and strength and love for this man was strong enough. Whether she had been depicted in battle or not, though, there's no doubt that Arwen is more present in the film adaptations than she ever is in the original The Lord of the Rings story. Both the written and cinematic versions of Arwen's story reconnect when she marries Aragorn. In all of the annals of Middle-earth lore, this becomes just the third time that an elf and a man get hitched, with both of the previous unions also taking place in their shared family tree. Their nuptials are a high watermark in the story of the two lovers. Of course, Arwen's marriage also means she officially becomes the queen of the reunited realms of Gondor and Arnor. Practically overnight, this makes her the most powerful woman in all of Middle-earth. As queen, she helps Aragorn rule their kingdom for 120 years. During that time, she brings Sam's daughter, Eleanor, to be her maid of honor in Minas Tirith. She also has at least 2 daughters, who remain nameless, and a son named Eldarion, who eventually succeeds his father to the throne. One of the most complicated and confusing elements about Arwen's life is her mortality, or more accurately, her immortality that is replaced by mortality. In essence, Arwen is allowed to choose between being immortal or mortal, since she has both elves and men in her ancestry.
The life of the Eldar is leaving you.
This was my choice.
However, the specific ground rules for this choice are never clarified by Tolkien. It would appear that, at least, once someone chooses to be mortal, the choice isn't given to their children. Regardless of the specifics, Arwen lives as an immortal elf until she gives up her immortality to marry Aragorn.
I choose a mortal life.
This enables her to grant Frodo her spot on the ship headed west to the Blessed Realm. but it also sets her up for a painfully difficult parting as well. When Arwen discusses her choice to become mortal in The Return of the King, she explains that she has chosen, quote, both the sweet and the bitter. And 120 years after her marriage to Aragorn, the bitter part really comes home to roost. After he passes and Eldarion becomes king, it says in the book that in her sorrow, she says goodbye to her children and her loved ones, and then she leaves Minas Tirith, returning to her past home of Lothlorien. However, by this time, Galadriel and her people have left, and no elves remain in the Golden Wood. She wanders there through the following winter, and then finally lies down to rest in the same place where she had betrothed herself to Aragorn so many years before. There, tasting the bitterness at the very end of her mortal life, she passes away quietly, eventually surrounded by a green grave that will never change until the world itself is altered.
We all know the story of the Lord of the Rings and its many heroes, villains, and epic battles. The story of the One Ring itself, however, is a longer one, with a history that stretches all the way back to the beginning of j.r.r. Tolkien's fictional universe. Sauron, the actual Lord of the Rings referred to in the title of Tolkien's epic, was created by the deity Eru in the time before the world was made. In his early life, he was called Myron and served as a craftsman to higher beings until he was corrupted by Morgoth, the original Dark Lord of Tolkien's world. Morgoth attempted to conquer Middle-earth in the First Age, and when he was defeated, Myron fled judgment, hiding in Middle-earth, building his power until he could make his next move. The elves ultimately came to call him Sauron. As the centuries passed, Sauron began calling himself the Lord of Gifts and visited the elves. Though some of the elves, including Galadriel and Elrond, distrusted him, the elven smith Celebrimbor was taken with Sauron's gifts, and together they began forging the Rings of Power. They eventually gave 19 rings to the races of Middle-earth. Sauron forged the One Ring in the volcanic fires of Mount Doom, pouring much of his own essence and power into it. The plan was to use the One to control the wearers of the other rings. Unfortunately for Sauron, the ring-bearing elves were able to sense the presence of the Dark Lord and avoid his control, leading to a war against Sauron for the Rings of Power. The war finally ended when an army of men joined with the elves. Sauron retreated back to Mordor to recover. More centuries passed as Sauron continued to fortify his stronghold in Mordor and completed the Tower of Barad-dûr. Near the end of the Second Age, he was strong enough to again attempt conquest of Middle-earth, but the armies of Numenor, the nation of men, marched against him. Sauron surrendered and was taken as prisoner, but he was not humbled by his supposed defeat. In Numenor, Sauron again assumed a beautiful appearance and convinced the Numenorians that they should worship his old master, Morgoth. It was here that Eru, the supreme creator of all, intervened. Numenor sank into the sea, its armies were drowned, and Sauron's physical form was destroyed. His spirit, however, was able to return to Mordor, tied to the material world by the One Ring. Led by Elendil, the survivors of Numenor escaped to Middle-earth. Sauron watched the formation of their kingdoms, and his hatred of Elendil led him to attack. Elendil and his sons, including Isildur, knew they couldn't battle Sauron alone, and formed the last alliance with the elves to make a stand against the darkness. The siege of Barad-dûr lasted for years until Sauron finally came out to join the fight himself. It was then that Isildur took up his father's sword, Narsil, and cut the One Ring from Sauron's hand. Sauron was defeated, and the victory marked the end of the Second Age. Sadly, Isildur was seduced by the One Ring's power and kept it for himself, only losing it when he was killed in an ambush by orcs. The ring vanished into a river and would not be seen again for centuries. For more than 2,000 years, the One Ring was lost. That changed the day two cousins, Smeagol and Deagol, went fishing near the spot where Isildur was killed. There, Deagol discovered a gold ring in the water. Smeagol was immediately drawn in by the One Ring's power, and when Deagol refused to give it to him, Smeagol responded by strangling his cousin and taking the One Ring for himself. Precious. With the ring granting him an endless life, he spent 500 years alone in the dark, as his body and mind were twisted by the ring. Over time, he came to be known as Gollum. Gollum and his ring lived in seclusion for centuries until a hobbit named Bilbo Baggins accidentally stumbled across the creature's lair while lost in the Misty Mountains. Bilbo found the ring in the dark and used it to escape Gollum after a riddle contest at which, quite frankly, Bilbo cheated.
How do I got in my pocket.
That's no fair. Though he initially lied about the ring, Bilbo did eventually tell the wizard Gandalf the Grey more details about how he came to possess it. Gandalf was able to deduce that it was one of Sauron's evil rings of power. Still, the wizard decided the ring was relatively safe in the Hobbit's hands, leaving Bilbo to keep it at his home in the Shire. Bilbo kept the ring for decades, intending to one day leave it to his nephew Frodo, with Gandalf's blessing. When the time came, though, Bilbo seemed reluctant to part with it. This led Gandalf to realize that Bilbo's ring was not just one of the magic rings, but the ring, Sauron's long-lost One Ring. The danger of the One Ring itself, coupled with Gollum's recent emergence in Middle-earth and the return of the dark forces like the ring-wraiths, led Gandalf back to the Shire to warn Frodo. He told the young hobbit to set out for the elven city of Rivendell, where Elrond was assembling a council. They decided that the ring must be taken to Mordor to be destroyed in the fires of Mount Doom, as it was the only way to prevent Sauron from eventually reclaiming it. Frodo volunteered to be the one to take it, and was joined in his quest by others.
You have my sword. And you have my bow.
And my axe.
The Fellowship of the Ring, as Frodo's group was now known, set out from Rivendell while agents of Sauron continued to pursue them and amass forces, leading to tragedy for the group.
Fly, you fools!
Later, when the Fellowship was attacked by orc warriors, Boromir, a noble soldier of Gondor, was killed while defending the lives of the hobbits. Before he died, however, Boromir succumbed to temptation and tried to take the ring from Frodo, which led Frodo to believe he needed to leave in order to spare his allies the burden of the ring's power. Sam refused to let Frodo go alone, and so the two ventured off to Mordor together. When Frodo and Sam became lost trying to find the way to Mordor, they realized that Gollum, who had been set free after torture at the hands of the orcs, was following them. After capturing him, Frodo and Sam ordered him to lead them to Mordor, a task he agreed to in order to stay close to the ring. Eventually, Frodo, Sam, and Gollum made their way into Sauron's Dark Realm. War erupted all around them, as the remainder of the Fellowship continued to battle orcish armies in a bid to buy Frodo time to destroy the ring. Gollum, meanwhile, continued to plot against the hobbits in order to retake the ring for himself. In his bid to eliminate the hobbits, Gollum led them to what he claimed was a shortcut to Mount Doom. In fact, it was the lair of the giant spider Shelob, who nearly killed the hobbits. When Sam and Frodo finally reached the fires of Doom, Frodo gave in to the ring's power and put it on, refusing to destroy it. It was here that Gollum made his move, pouncing on Frodo and biting off the finger that held the ring. Gollum, reunited with his precious at last, was too lost in celebration to see where he was standing. He fell off the edge into the magma below, destroying himself and the One Ring. Sauron, whose essence was directly tied to the ring, was defeated, and all of his armies instantly collapsed.
The Lord of the Rings is arguably the most iconic fantasy series of all time. But what are the real stories behind author J.r.r. Tolkien's beloved literary classics and their cinematic adaptations? This is the untold truth of The Lord of the Rings.
Well, it began as you might expect. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit.
As Tolkien explains in his foreword to The Fellowship of the Ring, the tale of The Lord of the Rings grew in the telling, with the author discovering more of it as he went along. This was largely due to the fact that the story had found its beginnings as a sequel to Tolkien's previously published children's book, The Hobbit. The thing is, The Hobbit was initially supposed to be a one-off thing. In a letter to his publisher, Tolkien discussed how he was struggling with the sequel to his beloved work, which had only been connected to his other Middle-earth writings by virtue of an occasional name drop, or the odd character crossover appearance, such as Elrond, the son of Arendelle, the Mariner. However, the success of The Hobbit led to such demand for more that eventually a sequel became inevitable. Even as the new book slowly took shape, though, it continued to be seen as another Hobbit book rather than its own story. For example, Tolkien's close friend and literary sounding board C.S. Lewis was known to refer to the work simply as The New Hobbit. Once Tolkien settled on making Bilbo's ring the connecting point from one book to the other, however, the new Hobbit grew into a massive story, one that could easily stand on its own. It didn't take long before the Fellowship of the Ring alone dwarfed the Hobbit in size. It turns out, though, that lengthening his story was actually one of Tolkien's main goals in writing it. The author points out in the foreword that the prime motive was the desire of a tale teller to try his hand at a really long story that would hold the attention of the readers. Tolkien also notes that while many readers might find his work to be overly long or boring, his opinion is that the most critical defect of the whole story is the simple fact that it's too short. Tolkien didn't always feel that way about The Lord of the Rings, though. In a letter to his editor in December 1939, he wrote that he feared that the story was growing too large. This wasn't a fleeting feeling either. In a letter to his son 5 years later, he reiterated, "I'm afraid I have made a great mistake in making my sequel too long and complicated." Fortunately for his readers, Tolkien didn't let his initial desire for brevity diminish the growing scope and scale of the story. Tolkien's writings went through a number of huge revisions over the course of his life. While this is especially true for many of the stories that ended up in the Silmarillion, it also affected The Lord of the Rings. One of the particularly egregious examples lies with the short-lived character of Bingo Baggins.
Hobbits.
According to author David R. Collins, when Tolkien first began to write what eventually became the Fellowship of the Ring, he created the character of Bilbo's son Bingo to carry on the story. However, this wasn't much to his liking, so he changed the character to Bingo Bolger Baggins, the nephew of the hero of The Hobbit. The thought was initially that Bingo would find a ring as his father or uncle had beforehand. As the story grew and became more serious, however, Tolkien eventually decided to change Bingo's name to the familiar Frodo that we all know and love. Middle-earth wasn't built in a day. In fact, Tolkien started creating his world in 1917, when he first composed the early drafts of The Fall of Gondolin, and continued until his death over half a century later. During that time, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings were published, but Tolkien's lifelong labor also yielded a treasure trove of other stories. Many of these were collected into his epic myth, The Silmarillion, while some found their way into other publications, including Unfinished Tales. This collection of literally unfinished stories filled in many of the gaps of knowledge that had been left out of The Lord of the Rings. While some scenes in Peter Jackson's movies might seem like elaborations on the original manuscripts, many of them actually find their origin in Unfinished Tales. From Isildur being ambushed by orcs, to an account of the death of Theodred at the battles of the Fords of Isen, to the story of the Black Rider's hunt for the ring, Unfinished Tales was doubtless a huge factor in helping to round the story as it was translated from book to script. While the world at large may see The Lord of the Rings as the pinnacle of Tolkien's writing, in many ways the story ended up being more of a bother to the author than anything else. In a letter to his publisher in February 1938, Tolkien explained that, "For the moment the story is not unfolding, I squandered so much on the original Hobbit, which was not meant to have a sequel, that it is difficult to find anything new in that world." In his foreword to The Fellowship of the Ring, he explains, "I had many duties that I did not neglect, and many other interests as a learner and teacher that often absorbed me." And then, of course, there was the rather hefty distraction of World War II, which happened to overlap neatly with the period of time in which he wrote The Lord of the Rings. But even when war, work, and family didn't call him away, Tolkien's greatest passion was still reserved for his other writings. In another letter to his publisher later in 1938, he said his mind was really preoccupied with the Silmarillion. While the world clamored for more adventures with hobbits, Tolkien's mind swirled with stories such as the Tale of Tenuviel, the fall of the elvish city of Gondolin, and the foundation of Middle-earth itself by Iluvatar and his mighty Valar. In many ways, The Lord of the Rings was little more than a tangential distraction from the real story of Middle-earth. From countless acting accolades to his epic military career to his passion for heavy metal music, Christopher Lee was a truly extraordinary man, and he was also head over heels about all things Middle-earth. Lee read Tolkien's books every year and was so passionate about the story that when he heard Peter Jackson was putting together a film adaptation, he wanted in as soon as possible. Incidentally, Lee's greatest desire wasn't to play Sauron the White, but rather Gandalf the Grey. While he didn't get to fulfill that particular dream, his presence as a seasoned Tolkien expert was invaluable for the film's cast and crew. While some actors came into the project still playing catch-up with the source material, Lee's annual return to Middle-earth ensured that he knew exactly where the story was going at all times. He also had the distinguished honor of being the only person on the entire set that actually had met Tolkien in person. Decades earlier, Lee had run into the author while visiting the Eagle and Child, one of Tolkien's favorite watering holes. While Viggo Mortensen's portrayal of Aragorn has been stamped on the hearts and minds of Middle-earth fans, the actor was actually nowhere to be seen when the camera started rolling. Instead, it was none other than Stuart Townsend who initially took on the role of Aragorn. However, a mere 3 days into filming, Townsend left the project and Mortensen was quickly tapped to replace him. As the dust settled, it became clear that the switch simply had come about because Townsend was too young to play the fearless king in exile, a feeling that, according to Jackson, Townsend himself shared. That didn't make matters easy for the incoming Mortensen though. He had never read the books before that point, and he was jumping into a key role next to actors that had been prepping for months. One thing he had going in his favor though was that he was already familiar with many of the old Norse sagas that had originally inspired Tolkien. Luckily, things worked out in the end, and Mortensen delivered an Aragorn for the ages. While Ian Holm is lovingly remembered for his portrayal of Bilbo in both The Lord of the Rings and certain scenes in the Hobbit trilogy, playing hobbits was actually old hat for the veteran actor long before he ever stepped foot on any of Jackson's sets. In fact, Holm's Middle-earth debut actually came in the form of a much younger character, none other than Bilbo's younger cousin, Frodo. Holm was cast as the ring bearer in a BBC radio broadcast of The Lord of the Rings in 1981. While the radio broadcast was a nice way to get his oversized, hairy hobbit feet wet, however, there's no doubt that he ratcheted things up a notch when he joined Jackson's mammoth cinematic production. Most people are familiar with Peter Jackson's iconic Lord of the Rings trilogy, but more savvy fans will know that they aren't the first film adaptation of Tolkien's saga. In 1978, animator Ralph Bakshi directed a Lord of the Rings film that brought the Fellowship of the Ring and part of the Two Towers to life on the big screen. While the film did quite well with audiences, bringing in tens of millions of dollars, in the grand scheme of things, it didn't capture the saga quite as thrillingly as the Jackson films that followed 2 decades later. Bakshi himself, however, disagrees. In a 2002 interview, he scoffed at the idea of watching Jackson's adaptation, wondering who needs the aggravation. Jackson clearly used Bakshi's animation as inspiration for many shots in his own film too, and Bakshi wasn't happy about this either, pointing out that it wasn't properly acknowledged in the films, while Jackson had denied it had any bearing on the issue until later. One thing the two directors had in common, however, is a true love of the source material. Bakshi says, "The books are absolutely perfect. There isn't a sellout moment in them. The characters and setting are staggering. Nothing like it in fantasy can touch it." In an era when motion capture characters have become as commonplace as they are breathtakingly realistic, it's easy to forget one of the greatest breakthroughs in mocap history, Gollum. Peter Jackson and company faced a huge challenge when it came to adapting Smeagol to the silver screen. He was integral to the storyline, required a lot of close-up screen time, and was practically buck naked too. So you couldn't settle for good facial expressions and throw an overcoat over the character to hide the rest. Weta Digital, the New Zealand-based company co-founded by Jackson, brought Gollum to life in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, as well as the Hobbit films that followed. But while they were focused on the technical aspects of the job, what they really needed was an actor brilliant enough to play the character on the set. Enter Andy Serkis, who delivered a performance for the ages, as he acted out many of Gollum's scenes while covered from head to toe in motion capture gear. The mingling of Weta Digital and Serkis was magical to say the least, delivering one of the first truly believable motion capture performances in cinema history.
What on earth? Sir,
It was a benchmark and an inspiration that spurred the development of countless other characters, including Marvel's Thanos and Caesar from Rise of the Planet of the Apes, the latter of whom, it's worth pointing out, was also played by Serkis. Peter Jackson is inextricably linked to The Lord of the Rings, and he will be for a long time. Even Amazon's grand plans for a series set in Middle-earth couldn't get started without him, with rumors suggesting that Amazon had made at least some effort to incorporate Jackson's vision into their new project. However, before Jackson, there were The Beatles? Yes, the Fab Four actually tried to get the rights to make the Lord of the Rings films themselves, and they didn't just want to produce them, they wanted to star in them as well. Paul McCartney would play Frodo, George Harrison would play Gandalf, Ringo Starr was to be Sam, and John Lennon would be Gollum. They wanted to use original songs in the production, and even approached Stanley Kubrick to direct. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Tolkien put an end to that particular adaptation before it could ever really begin. J.r.r. Tolkien's most famous works take place in the Third Age of Middle-earth, and the author has expanded on the history of his legendarium elsewhere. But what about the years after the end of the War of the Ring? Just what happened in Middle-earth's Fourth Age? If you want to properly understand the Fourth Age, it's important to get a good idea of what led up to it. The First Age begins when the Dark Lord Morgoth sneaks into the realm of Valinor, steals the one-of-a-kind jewels known as the Silmarils, and hightails it back to Middle-earth. Looking for revenge, a faction of elves set out in pursuit of their enemy. These elves spend the next 500 years waging war against Morgoth. They win some early victories, but over time, the Dark Lord regains the initiative and eventually utterly overwhelms the elves and their mortal allies. The Free Peoples are only saved from defeat when Aragorn's ancestor, Eärendil, sails back to the Blessed Realm and asks the godlike Valar for help. This leads to the catastrophic War of Wrath, in which Morgoth is overthrown, his servants are scattered, and vast swaths of Middle-earth are drowned beneath the sea. The Second Age is defined by a rise of a new Dark Lord, Morgoth's chief lieutenant, Sauron. This age is peaceful at first as the remaining elves resettle in their new homes in the eastern regions of Middle-earth, and men continue to populate the continent. Off the coast, some of these men found the island kingdom of Numenor. Eventually, Sauron makes his return to Middle-earth. Disguised as an elf named Anatar, he helps the elves forge rings of power and then creates his own ring in secret to control them. When this backfires on Sauron, he declares war on the elves and redistributes most of the elvish rings to races he can more easily control.
One ring to rule them all.
Sauron nearly succeeds in conquering all of Middle-earth, but when he is confronted by the full might of Numenor, he willingly surrenders himself to them. Sauron, however, has a plan. Taken back to the island nation, the Dark Lord corrupts its king and many of its people, and eventually convinces them to invade Valinor and take on the Valar themselves. This goes pretty badly, to say the least, and Numenor itself is sunk beneath the sea as a result. One faction of uncorrupted Numenorians survives, however, and settle two kingdoms on the mainland, Gondor and Arnor. When Sauron arrives back on the continent and begins to stir up trouble again, these two kingdoms join forces with the elves. Together they march on Mordor, defeat Sauron's armies, and cut the ring from the Dark Lord's hand. For the first millennium of the Third Age, Middle-earth is at peace. Around 1,000 years into the Third Age, the Valar send the 5 wizards to Middle-earth to help guide the free folk in their struggle against evil. Around the same time, the forces of Sauron begin to muster. The kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor are involved in a number of conflicts over the ensuing years. Arnor is eventually destroyed in a war against the Witch King, and Gondor loses its own king, leading to the long rule of the Stewards. The Shire is also founded about halfway through the Third Age. Rohan is settled 900 years later, and after that, Saruman settles down in Isengard and starts to break bad. Meanwhile, the dwarves unleash the Balrog in Moria, duke it out with the orcs of the Misty Mountains, and fight a war against Morgoth's dragons that eventually leads to Smaug attacking the Lonely Mountain. To top all of the drama off, the One Ring is eventually rediscovered, leading to the War of the Ring and the final destruction of Sauron. The Fourth Age begins with the end of the War of the Ring. The specific date of the beginning of the age is the source of some contention, but in the appendix to The Return of the King at least, it's officially recorded that this age begins when the keepers of the 3 elven rings, that is Elrond, Galadriel, and Gandalf, set sail for Valinor. This, for the record, is September 29th of the 3021st year of the Third Age. In a timeline Tolkien provided in the appendix to The Return of the King, he writes, Frodo and Bilbo depart oversea with the Three Keepers, the end of the Third Age. With the departure of the Three Rings from Middle-earth, the kingdoms of men find their true place in the world. This new order is predicted by Gandalf in The Return of the King, which he tells the ancient Ent, Treebeard. The New Age begins, and in this age it may well prove that the kingdoms of men shall outlast you, Fangorn, my friend. The definitive event of the early Fourth Age is the coronation of Aragorn as a ruler of Gondor and Arnor.
Let us together rebuild this world, that we may share in the days of peace.
The name Elisar, the new king, becomes protector of a huge portion of Middle-earth and proceeds to rule over his new realm for an incredible 120 years. During this time, he declares the Shire a free region under his protection and gives most of Saruman's former domain to the Ents. Aragorn also makes his steward Faramir the Prince of Ithilien. Faramir becomes one of Aragorn's chief generals, and in a letter later in life, Tolkien even explained that the king made Faramir the lead counselor of his chief advisory group, known as the Great Council of Gondor. Aragorn also remains close with Éomer, who rules as the King of Rohan for 65 years. These brothers at heart renew the oath of Eorl, swearing to come to one another's aid when needed. In The Return of the King, Tolkien writes that they fight together often because, for though Sauron has passed, the hatreds and evils that he bred had not died, and the King of the West had many enemies to subdue. Aragorn and Arwen marry just before the beginning of the Fourth Age. They proceed to rule happily for over a century, and the Queen gives birth to a son named Eldarion and a number of daughters. 120 years into the Fourth Age, at the ripe old age of 210 years old, King Elisar finally dies. However, he doesn't pass in his sleep, nor is he killed in battle. Instead, Aragorn willingly gives up his spirit before he becomes old and broken. It is also explained that after Aragorn's death, Arwen went forth from the house, and the light of her eyes was quenched, and it seemed to her people that she had become cold and gray as nightfall in winter that comes without a star. The queen then bids farewell to her children and travels to Lothlorien. All of the elves have left the Golden Wood by this point, but she wanders through the empty land nonetheless. Eventually, she lies down to rest in the same spot where she and Aragorn had become engaged long before. There, she quietly dies, and it's said that her green grave will remain until the world is changed. In Gondor, Eldarion becomes king, and in a letter written in 1972, Tolkien briefly mentioned that his reign lasts for roughly a century.
I thought I'd die fighting side by side with an elf.
What about side by side with a friend?
After Sauron is defeated and the War of the Ring comes to an end, Legolas and Gimli stay pretty busy. On their way home from war, these newfound friends first visit the Ents in Fangorn and then Aglarond, the glittering caves hidden behind Helm's Deep. Afterwards, Gimli returns to the Lonely Mountain, only to find that the War of the Ring has devastated the whole region. Eventually, he gathers some of his fellow dwarf folk, and they settle down in Aglarond. Gimli himself leads the dwarven colony, becoming the Lord of the Glittering Caves. This relocation puts Gimli close to Minas Tirith. And The Return of the King states, he and his people did great works in Gondor and Rohan. Of particular note, they fixed the gates of Minas Tirith, which the Witch King's army had smashed, forging the replacement parts out of steel and mithril. Legolas does his part to back up Aragorn's fledgling new kingdom too, and brings elves from Mirkwood to settle in Ithilien. After Aragorn dies, however, Legolas finally follows the calling of his kind and takes a ship across the sea for Valinor. Interestingly, Tolkien claims that because of their one-of-a-kind friendship, Gimli is also given permission to travel with his elven friend to the otherworldly realm. The Shire remains a bustling center of rural activity during the Fourth Age, and Sam, Merry, and Pippin are at the heart of the action. Sam and Rose have 13 children, and their daughter Goldilocks ends up marrying Pippin's son, Faramir. Sam inherits Bag End, finishes writing the Red Book that Bilbo and Frodo had worked on, and is elected the mayor of the Shire's unofficial capital, Mickle Delving, for 7 consecutive terms. Pippin remains a knight of Gondor and also becomes the Took and Thane, both important leadership positions in his family and the Shire, respectively. Merry becomes the Master of Buckland, a small colony settled long before by his family just outside of the borders of the Shire. Eventually, Rose dies, and legend states that Sam, the last of the ring bearers, actually follows his master west to the Undying Lands. A couple of years later, the elderly Merry and Pippin leave the Shire and head south. They eventually die in Gondor, where they are laid to rest next to Aragorn. Details regarding the Fourth Age are hard to come by, especially after the first couple of centuries. However, it seems clear that by this point in the timeline, the Age of Men has truly dawned. The First and Second Ages had been dominated by the elves and the dwarves, while the Third Age had seen men slowly rise to prominence. By the Fourth Age, however, the elves and dwarves are clearly on the way out, and men are on the up and up. In the prologue to the Fellowship of the Ring, it's explained that some of the High Elven folk remain in Middle-earth for a time, led by Elrond's sons and eventually joined by Galadriel's husband Celeborn. While it isn't known when Celeborn finally sails to the Blessed Realm, when he does go, he takes with him the last living memory of the Elder Days in Middle-earth. The dwarves remain in Middle-earth, however, and judging from Gimli's colonization efforts, even appear to expand their dominions for a time. Nevertheless, they do slowly drift out of sight, out of mind, and eventually right out of Middle-earth's history. Aside from The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, most of the Middle-earth material that we have today was published by j.r.r. Tolkien's son, Christopher Tolkien, after his father's death. This wasn't for the elder Tolkien's lack of dedication to his world, though. It was more the result of a deep-set perfectionism that held the great author back from publishing much other material. Nevertheless, Tolkien did try to publish more Middle-earth stories during his lifetime, including a sequel to The Lord of the Rings. Called The New Shadow, the story appeared to be set a century or so after Aragorn's death, placing it well into the Fourth Age. The concept toyed with a resurgence of evil in Middle-earth long after the events of The Lord of the Ring had become ancient history. However, Tolkien never got more than a handful of pages into the story before he gave up. In a letter written in 1964, he referred to the project as both sinister and depressing, adding that it had the making of a thriller, but that it was, alas, simply not worth doing. Tolkien's letters are an important source of information for fans of Middle-earth, as the author used them to reveal more about Middle-earth's long and complex history. In one of those letters, the author provides a hint as to when he personally believed the Fourth Age ended, or at least how it fits into the world's larger history. In this letter, Tolkien points out that he imagines the 20th century to exist roughly 6,000 years after the Third Age. He initially states that this could put us somewhere around the end of the Fifth Age, judging from the approximate lengths of the Second and Third Ages. However, he also clarifies, they have, I think, quickened, and I imagine we are actually at the end of the Sixth Age or in the Seventh. While nobody can be sure the exact timeline of the Fourth Age, it is clear that at one point, the future of Tolkien's world becomes the distant past of our own.
From armies of dragons to tragic heroes, legions of Balrogs, massive wars, foul treachery, and a trio of superpowered gems that make the One Ring feel like your great-grandmother's pearl necklace. Here are the epic events that shaped the First Age of Tolkien's Middle-earth. The First Age comes on the heels of the Years of the Lamps and the Years of the Trees. The Years of the Lamps lasts for millennia and finds the Valar, the spirit guardians of Middle-earth, squaring off against the Dark Lord Morgoth, whose second-in-command, Sauron, will be the scourge of the Third Age. This world-shaking conflict leads to the Years of the Trees, which starts after the Valar withdraw to the Blessed Realm. Here, two mighty glowing trees take turns illuminating the continent. In the following millennia, the elves awaken for the first time. Fearing for the safety of these new creatures, the Valar defeat and capture Morgoth and encourage the elves to come and live with them in the West. Many elves heed the call, while others remain in Middle-earth. The next few thousand years are a time of peace as Morgoth serves a 3-age-long prison sentence, and the elves that went west flourish in the Blessed Realm. It's at this early date that both Galadriel and Fëanor are born. With some help from Shelob's distant mother, Ungoliant, Morgoth destroys the two trees and hightails it back to Middle-earth where many of his servants, including Sauron, have been hiding. On his way out of the Blessed Realm, Morgoth kills Feanor's father and steals the Silmarils. Artifacts even more sacred than the light of Eärendil, the Silmarils are jewels that contain the living light of the destroyed trees. In the fallout from Morgoth's betrayal, Feanor rallies his elves, known as the Noldor, and convinces most of them to disobey the Valar and leave the Blessed Realm to reclaim the jewels. This rebellion is cast in disarray when Feanor convinces a loyal subsection of his people to attack other elves as they leave, seizing their boats to sail back across the sea to Middle-earth. As Feanor sails back to Middle-earth with a handful of the Noldor, the majority of the elves are left to find their own way on foot. This group, which includes Galadriel, didn't participate in seizing the boats. They decide to head into the frozen north and cross the water at a pass where the two continents are closer together. Roughly marking the beginning of the First Age, the Noldor elves arrive in Middle-earth. This is also the moment when the Valar, saddened by the rebellion of the elves, still show their support for them by launching the sun and the moon into the sky to replace the light of the two trees. In the eastern regions, men awaken. While it will take centuries for them to make their way to the elves, they exist, and they'll eventually wander right into the First Age action.
Out of the frying pan.
And into the fire. Run! Run!
Led by Feanor, the smaller group of Noldor return to Middle-earth, catching Morgoth by surprise. The villain has set up shop in his fortress. Known as Angband, Morgoth's seat of power is even more foreboding than Sauron's. Unprepared for an attack by the elves, Morgoth's forces are decimated. Despite Morgoth's resounding defeat, Feanor is mortally wounded by a Balrog, a tough foe for even the mighty Gandalf. After a 75-year pause in the battle, Morgoth attacks again, but like Sauron after him, faces defeat at the hands of the elves. Emboldened, the elves attack his mountain fortress, known as the Siege of Angband. The battle lasts close to 400 years. As the Siege of Angband drags on, the elves that aren't fighting on the front lines establish the hidden cities of Nargothrond and Gondolin. This pair of fortress kingdoms becomes crucial in holding off Morgoth. While the primary focus of the First Age follows the Noldor as they build cities and battle with Morgoth over the Silmarils, another branch of elven kind is also important. Known as the Sindar or the Grey Elves, they're the elven race of Thranduil and his son, Legolas. Initially, the elves continued to deal with occasional attacks from Morgoth's forces. 200 years into the siege, the first dragon, Glaurung, ancestor to Smaug, appears. Still young, it doesn't take much for the elves to send him scampering back to his master. After this, the Long Peace begins, during which Morgoth remains quiet and the elves remain vigilant. The Long Peace is a time of great prosperity and optimism. Believing that the Silmarils will soon be back in their hands, the kingdoms of the elves thrive. During the Long Peace, men enter Middle-earth history. Wandering in from the eastern lands, many of these men are seduced by Morgoth, just as King Theoden will fall under Sauron's spell in Lord of the Rings. However, 3 clans befriend the elves and join their cause. These men are known as the Edain, or the 3 Houses.
I am no man.
The Long Peace ends when Morgoth unexpectedly unleashes rivers of fire from his mountain fortress, leading armies of orcs and Balrogs. A now fully grown Glaurung attacks the elves. Known as the Battle of Sudden Flame, the assault leaves the Noldor reeling. While the Battle of Sudden Flame is a solid defeat for the forces of good, it does lead to 2 of the most epic events in all of Tolkien's writings. First, the Noldor king, Fingolfin, becomes so enraged that he rides to Angband to challenge the Dark Lord Morgoth to single combat, just as Éowyn will one day face the Witch King alone. The duel is intense as the Elf Lord dodges Morgoth's deadly mace and manages to wound him 7 times. Despite his valiant efforts, the brave Fingolfin dies by Morgoth's hand. Nearly 20 years after their initial defeat, the elves gather their forces and attack Morgoth in one final, massive bid for victory. One of the most glorious First Age battles, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, leaves the elven armies in ruins and Morgoth virtually unchallenged in Middle-earth. While the Battle of Unnumbered Tears makes Morgoth the most powerful being on the continent, that doesn't mean his enemies are completely defeated. The kingdoms of Nargothrond, Gondolin, and Doriath remain. Well hidden, these kingdoms are reluctant to resist the resurgent Dark Lord in the open. The elves never fully recover from the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. Weak and divided, they're slowly consumed by the forces of darkness. Morgoth discovers Nargothrond and Gondolin, the first by stupidity and the second by treachery, and destroys them both.
I will not stand down before any elf, not least this faithless woodland sprite.
Romance in Tolkien's writing isn't limited to Aragorn and Arwen. One of the author's most celebrated First Age epics is a love story. The tale of Beren and Luthien begins when Beren, a man, escapes into the enchanted kingdom of the Doriath after his lands are devastated by the Battle of Sudden Flame. There, he meets Luthien, the daughter of the elf king Thingol, and the two fall in love. However, the king is appalled at the thought of his daughter marrying a fugitive and a mortal man. He jokingly tells Beren that if he can personally get one of the 3 Silmarils from Morgoth's Iron Crown and act even more daring than Bilbo's theft of the Arkenstone, he can marry his daughter. Beren departs on his quest, but soon finds that Luthien has come to help him. Side by side, the lovers travel to Angband and steal a Silmaril. Throughout the adventure, Luthien pulls most of the weight with her magical abilities. As they return home, the great wolf Kakaroth, who makes the Hobbit's wargs look like mere pups, steals the Silmaril, biting off Beren's hand in the process. Eventually, they hunt Kakaroth down and recover the jewel, but Beren dies of his wounds. Grief-stricken, Luthien also perishes. Their tragic romance is so moving that the couple is returned to life. Luthien is made mortal, and the pair are allowed to return to Middle-earth, where they live for a while longer together. An epic tragedy, the tale of the children of Hurin, is the story of a brave chieftain of men captured during the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. Morgoth, in an act more cruel than even anything conceived by the Lord of the Rings Witch King, tortures Hurin, hoping he will reveal the location of the hidden city of Gondolin. Hurin is unyielding. Angered, the Dark Lord curses Hurin's family and forces him to witness the destruction of his wife and children. Hurin's son, Turin, is at first raised by the elves in Doriath, but he flees after he accidentally kills a mocking elf in a brawl. From there, he launches into a heroic career to rival that of the Third Age's Boromir. Repeatedly, he rises to glory only to face utter ruin. Turin heads to the hidden kingdom of Nargothrond, where he convinces the elvish leadership to fight in the open, leading to the utter destruction of the cavernous underground realm. Unfortunately, Glaurung the dragon, deceitful as the hobbit's Smaug, brainwashes both Turin and his sister Niniel. Under the dragon's enchantment, the two meet and, not knowing they're related, marry and conceive a child. Eventually, Turin kills Glaurung. Realizing what they've done, the siblings take their own lives. The third great epic of the First Age is the tale of Arendelle, the Mariner. Directly related to all 3 of the houses of men as well as the elves, Arendelle is born in Gondolin and flees the city's destruction as a child. Escaping to the western shores of Middle-earth, where a group of exiles has settled in the wake of Morgoth's resurgent power, Arendelle marries Elwyn, the granddaughter of Beren and Luthien, who herself will be the grandmother of Gondor's future queen, Arwen. The parents of Elrond and his brother Elrus, who begins the line of kings that leads to Aragorn, Arendelle, and Elwing, are a Tolkien power couple. Arendelle becomes famous in his own right when he builds a ship and heads out in search of the Blessed Realm. Eventually, Elwyn joins him. Together, they reach the Blessed Realm and ask the Valar to return to Middle-earth and help their relatives, who are on the brink of destruction. The Guardians, moved by personal sacrifice, forgive the elves and respond to the call. Once the Valar receive Arendelle's plea for aid, they gather a massive army and head to Middle-earth to face down Morgoth once and for all. Morgoth has grown even more powerful, and unlike his lieutenant Sauron, doesn't need a magic ring to inflict his will. Known as the War of Wrath, the conflict that ensues makes the Battle of the Five Armies look like a barroom brawl. Elves, men, gods, eagles, dragons, balrogs, and orcs enter the fray in an all-out battle of good versus evil. Morgoth's armies are powerful, but ultimately, they can't overcome the host from the Blessed Realm. Facing a defeat as total as Sauron's future fall, Morgoth is dethroned and his armies vanquished. However, the fight is so intense that it breaks the land, causing a flood. As water rushes in, the region is completely submerged. This event creates the familiar map of Middle-earth we know from The Lord of the Rings. With the land sinking beneath their feet, most of the elves and Valar head back to the Blessed Realm. However, many others, both good and evil, choose to head east. Here, the First Age ends and the Second Age begins. and with it comes a new threat in the form of Morgoth's second-in-command, Sauron, who will prove to be an even more powerful foe.